quiet desperation hummed through the hollow spaces of a world too often steeped in shadow, a truth Martha knew as intimately as the rhythmic ache in her own joints. He came to her door not with the usual bravado or the forced pleasantries of traveling men, but broken, a vessel emptied by a relentless tide. His plea, a raw whisper against the biting wind, was for shelter, for his disabled black daughter, a child he could no longer carry alone through the wilderness of their shared existence. The words hung in the frigid air, heavy with unspoken fears, painting a stark portrait of a father's last, desperate gamble. She observed him from the sliver of space between door and jamb, her gaze dissecting his tattered clothes, the haunted depths of his eyes, and then, slowly, shifting to the small, bundled form huddled in a makeshift sling on his back. A tiny face, barely visible, fragile as spun glass, emerged from the folds of fabric. This was Ilara, he called her, a name like a fragile bell in the silence. Martha's home, a sturdy, defiant structure against the backdrop of a decaying town, had always been her fortress, a place where the jagged edges of the outside world rarely intruded. But now, this man, this child, stood on her threshold, a challenge to her solitude, a mirror reflecting a past she had painstakingly buried beneath layers of stoicism. A cold knot tightened in her stomach, a familiar sensation of dread and a peculiar, unsettling pull. What kind of future could such a request promise? What hidden currents lurked beneath the surface of such overt vulnerability? The world outside her door was unforgiving, a predator's den, and she, Martha, had learned long ago to become both hunter and prey, a master of self-preservation. Yet the child's small, shivering form seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed defenses, a faint tremor in the rigid architecture of her resolve. This was a moment, she knew, that would ripple outward, altering the very fabric of her guarded life. For better or for worse, a silent pact forged in the cold twilight. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The father's eyes, pools of exhaustion and despair, locked onto Martha's, a silent plea that transcended spoken words. He spoke of the long journey, the rejection they faced at every turn, the daughter's condition worsening with each passing day. Ilara, he explained, suffered from a mysterious ailment, one that had twisted her small limbs and dulled the sparkle in her eyes, leaving her largely unresponsive, a ghost in her own body. He couldn't provide for her, not anymore, not with the cold hunger gnawing at their insides and the relentless stares of a world that saw only defect and burden. Martha stood there, a statuesque figure framed by the dim light of her hallway, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Her home, stark and spare, had always echoed with the absence of sound, the quietude she fiercely guarded. The thought of a child's uncertain future, a child so utterly dependent, stirred something within her that felt both foreign and disturbingly familiar. She considered the unspoken costs, the whispers that would inevitably follow, the weight of a life she had chosen to leave behind. Her mind, a labyrinth of guarded memories, searched for a reason to refuse, to send them back into the encroaching darkness. But then, a faint sound, a small, almost imperceptible sigh, escaped Ilara's lips. It was a fragile breath, barely astir in the quiet air, yet it resonated deep within Martha, striking a discordant chord she had long believed silenced. It was not pity that moved her, not entirely, but something far more complex, a shadow of an old wound, a flicker of an ancient unfulfilled desire. She saw in Ilara not just a disabled child, but a reflection, distorted yet undeniably present, of a life once touched by fragile hope, then irrevocably broken. Her lips parted, words forming slowly, heavy with the weight of consequence. She would take the girl in, she finally conceded, her voice a low murmur, barely audible over the rising wind. The father sagged with relief, a broken man momentarily mended by this slender thread of compassion, unaware of the intricate, hidden tapestry Martha was already weaving. Ilara's presence in Martha's quiet home was like a stone dropped into a still, dark pond, sending ripples outward that disturbed the ingrained patterns of solitude. The child was small, almost translucent, her delicate skin a stark contrast to Martha's weathered hands. Her limbs were contorted, a silent testament to the illness that held her captive. rendering her world a silent, unmoving canvas. Martha moved around her with a strange blend of caution and familiarity, her rough hands surprisingly gentle as she tended to Alara's basic needs. She fed the child spoonfuls of thin broth, changed her soiled cloths, and bathed her in lukewarm water, the entire time observing Alara with an intense, almost clinical scrutiny. There was no reciprocal gaze, no flicker of understanding in Alara's eyes, only a vacant stare that seemed to look beyond the immediate, into a realm Martha could not penetrate. The father, a man nameless and fleeting, had vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind only the ghost of his desperation and the heavy burden of his daughter. He had given no forwarding address, no promise of return, simply a desperate, silent plea for a chance. Martha suspected he would not return. She had seen such men before, desperate creatures who shed their responsibilities like old skin. The town, a collection of tired faces and sharper tongues, quickly took notice. Whispers coiled through the narrow streets like smoke, curling around Martha's door, dissecting her unusual act of charity. "Why, her?" they muttered, their eyes narrowed, their voices laced with suspicion. Martha, known for her guarded nature and solitary existence, was an unlikely savior. What's she really after? They wondered, their minds quick to conjure tales of dark intentions, of hidden motives lurking beneath the veneer of kindness. Martha felt their collective gaze, a physical weight pressing against her windows, their judgment a constant, insidious hum. She saw their fear, their prejudice reflected in their sidelong glances at Alara, a child who embodied everything they feared and rejected. They saw only burden, a stain on their pristine, homogeneous world. But Martha, cloaked in her stoicism, held her secrets close, letting their accusations wash over her like inconsequential rain. The days bled into weeks, each marked by the subtle, rhythmic creak of the old house settling, and the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of Alara's breathing. Martha found herself falling into an unexpected rhythm, a silent dance with the fragile life entrusted to her care. She would sit by Alara's bedside for hours, meticulously cleaning the child's tangled hair, smoothing the creases from her small garments, sometimes humming a low, tuneless melody she hadn't hummed in decades. Alara remained largely unresponsive, a doll-like figure, but Martha began to notice small, almost imperceptible shifts. A slight tilt of the head towards a patch of sunlight, a fleeting tremor of her fingers when Martha spoke a particular word, a phantom of a smile playing on her lips in sleep. These were not grand gestures, not signs of miraculous recovery, but rather tiny fissures in the wall of Alara's quietude, cracks through which a faint, nascent connection might one day blossom. Yet even as this fragile bond tentatively formed, a shadow persisted, clinging to Martha like a shroud. Her care for Alara was meticulous, almost obsessive, a devotion that seemed to transcend simple charity. It was in the way her gaze lingered on Alara's unseeing eyes, a look that held not just compassion but a piercing, almost desperate recognition. A memory, fleeting as a moth's wing, would sometimes brush against the edges of her mind. A younger face, bright eyes, a laughter that had once filled these very rooms. A sharp, almost painful pang would seize her, quickly suppressed, driven back into the dark recesses where she kept her ghosts. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. One afternoon, as she helped Alara into a fresh shift, Martha noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird clutched in the child's tiny hand. It was old, worn smooth by countless touches, and its presence felt deeply unsettling. She tried to gently pry it from Alara's grip, but the child's fingers, though frail, clung to it with surprising tenacity. A sudden chill snaked down Martha's spine. The bird, so innocently held, felt like a silent sentinel, a key to a truth Martha had desperately sought to bury. The wooden bird, clutched in Alara's unresponsive hand, was a ghost made manifest, a silent scream from a forgotten time. Martha recognized it instantly, a tremor running through her as she carefully, almost reverently, uncurled Alara's fingers, retrieving the small carved piece of wood. It was identical to one her own daughter, Sarah, had cherished, a gift from a traveling artisan years ago before the darkness descended. Sarah. The name was a whispered curse and a sacred prayer, echoing in the hollow chambers of Martha's heart. Sarah, who had possessed the same delicate features, the same trusting innocence as Ilara before the fever took hold, stealing her light, leaving her twisted and broken, a shadow of the vibrant child she once was. Martha had nursed her, cradled her, fought against the relentless tide of her illness, but it was a losing battle. The town, the same town now whispering about Ilara, had looked upon Sarah with a similar mixture of pity and revulsion, their unspoken judgment a suffocating blanket. A burden, they'd called her, God's punishment. Martha had watched her daughter fade, a slow, agonizing surrender, then buried her in the cold earth, burying a piece of herself alongside her. The bitterness had festered, a poison in her soul, turning her compassionate heart into a fortress of ice. Now this child, Ilara, the wooden bird, it was too much, too uncanny a resemblance. A new understanding, sharp and terrible, began to solidify in Martha's mind. The father, the desperate, nameless man, had come begging, yes, but he had also provided Martha with something she hadn't realized she was waiting for: an echo, a surrogate, a chance to rewrite the ending to her own tragedy. Her initial act of charity, cloaked in compassion, was now revealed as something far more complex, a desperate, morally ambiguous grasp at redemption, or perhaps revenge. The bird felt warm in her hand, a living link to a past that refused to stay buried, a stark reminder of the reason she had truly opened her door. The revelation of the wooden bird, a tangible link to her own agonizing past, solidified the true, unsettling nature of Martha's hospitality. It was not merely an act of kindness, but a meticulously woven web of quiet intent, drawing Ilara, the innocent, unwitting pawn, into the center of Martha's long-held grief. Her care for the child, previously seen as a grudging duty or nascent affection, now appeared as an elaborate reenactment, a desperate attempt to reclaim a lost fragment of her soul. She would look at Ilara, her features a study in passive acceptance, and see Sarah, whole and vibrant, then broken and fading, then alive again, albeit through a distorted reflection. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She, who had scorned the world's pity, was now enacting her own twisted form of it, a surrogate mother tending a child who mirrored her greatest loss. The town's whispers, once a mere annoyance, now felt like a chorus of unseeing judgment, their ignorance a shield against the true darkness of Martha's heart. They saw only the charitable woman, the unlikely saint. They saw nothing of the woman who held on to Ilara not for the child's sake alone, but for her own, a desperate clinging to a ghost. The open loop of her daughter's death, the unresolved grief, the feeling of utter helplessness, had festered into this, a quiet, almost predatory possession. Ilara's father, the man who had abandoned her, remained an enigma. Had he known? Had he seen something in Martha, a shared sorrow, a dormant rage that made him choose her door above all others? Or was it merely a stroke of cruel, indifferent fate? The mystery of his disappearance deepened the suspense, leaving Martha as Ilara's sole guardian, both savior and silent captor. The world outside pressed in, a cold, unfeeling entity, but within the walls of her home, a different kind of tension built, a silent internal storm, swirling around the small, disabled girl and the woman who held her captive in a gilded cage of grief. The tension within Martha's home, once a silent current, now hummed with an almost palpable intensity. Her careful facade, constructed over years of solitude and loss, began to crack under the weight of her own complex motives. The townsfolk, ever watchful, ever judgmental, noticed the change in her. Her guardedness intensified, morphing into an almost fierce protectiveness of Ilara, a defensiveness that felt disproportionate to the child's quiet presence. "She treats that girl like gold," they observed, their voices laced with suspicion. "But there's something unnatural about it." They knew Martha's history, or at least the version she allowed them to see. The grieving mother, the reclusive widow. But the true depths of her despair, the insidious way it had twisted her spirit, remained hidden. A local busybody, Mrs. Gable, a woman with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that spared no one, began to take a particular interest. She lingered near Martha's gate, her gaze sharp, dissecting, seeking out inconsistencies. She spread rumors of strange occurrences, of Martha's late-night vigils by Alara's bedside, of hushed, one-sided conversations. The town, already steeped in prejudice against the outsider child, was fertile ground for such suspicions. Martha felt the tightening noose of their scrutiny, a suffocating pressure. She knew that her actions, however well-intentioned on the surface, would eventually be questioned, dissected, and condemned. A memory, cold and clear as ice, resurfaced. The town's disdain during Sarah's illness, their thinly veiled accusations of Martha's culpability, their whispers of a curse. It was a familiar pattern, a cyclical torment. This time, however, Martha was not merely a victim of their judgment. She was an architect of her own ambiguous fate. The irony was a cutting edge. She had brought Alara into her home seeking a perverse form of solace, only to find herself trapped in a cage of her own making, the bars fashioned from grief and deceit. The absence of Alara's father, once a convenient void, now felt like a looming question mark, a silent accusation that hung heavy in the air, a sword poised to fall. The approaching reckoning cast a long, skeletal shadow over Martha's strained existence. Mrs. Gable, propelled by a righteous fervor and the insidious whispers of the town, had become a relentless, unyielding force. She petitioned the local authorities, citing Martha's reclusive nature, the father's mysterious disappearance, and the perceived vulnerability of the disabled child. The small, sleepy town, rarely stirred by such drama, found itself caught in a silent, escalating conflict. Martha against the weight of societal judgment. A new figure emerged from the periphery, a stern-faced official, his uniform crisp, his questions sharper than any blade. He arrived at Martha's door, his presence a jarring intrusion into her carefully curated isolation. He spoke of welfare, of proper care, of accountability, his words echoing the very sentiments that had once condemned Martha's own daughter. A profound sense of dread, cold and pervasive, seeped into Martha's bones. This was it, the inevitable climax she had both feared and, in some twisted way, anticipated. She looked at Alara, lying so peacefully in her bed, oblivious to the storm raging around her, and a strange mix of fierce protectiveness and bitter resignation washed over her. A more vivid flashback assaulted her then, unbidden and brutal. The last night with Sarah, her daughter's ragged breath, the desperate pleas Martha made to a silent, unhearing God, the bitter taste of helplessness as Sarah slipped away. She remembered the official who had come then too, his voice devoid of compassion, his pronouncements sterile and clinical, accusing Martha of failing her child, of not doing enough. The memory fueled a raw, desperate defiance within her. She had failed Sarah, yes, but not for lack of love, only lack of power. This time with Alara she would not be powerless. She would not let them take this child, this fragile living echo of her own lost hope. But the cost of this defiance, she knew, would be immense. The moral ambiguity of her actions, once a whispered secret, was now laid bare, stark and unforgiving. Was she a savior, genuinely trying to protect Alara from a world that would undoubtedly reject her, just as it had rejected Sarah? Or was she a captor, holding on to the child for her own twisted sense of purpose, a desperate attempt to rewrite a tragedy that could never be undone? The answer remained elusive, shrouded in the deepening twilight. The day of reckoning arrived with the stark chill of an early winter morning, piercing through the illusion of Martha's quiet sanctuary. The stern-faced official, accompanied by Mrs. Gable, whose eyes gleamed with vindication, returned, their presence a stark reminder of the world's unyielding grip. They demanded answers, their voices sharp and uncompromising, questioning Martha's suitability, her motives, the very legality of Alara's presence. Martha stood before them, a formidable, albeit weathered figure, her face a mask of stone, yet within, a tempest raged. The air thickened with unspoken accusations, with the weight of society's judgment, mirroring the suffocation Martha had felt during Sarah's last days. This confrontation was not merely about Alara, it was about Martha's past, her choices, her very soul laid bare. The pivotal emotional climax unfolded not in dramatic shouts, but in the brittle silence of her living room, in the fierce, unspoken battle between a hardened woman and a world determined to pry open her carefully guarded heart. The truth, raw and unvarnished, finally surfaced. Martha admitted to taking Ilara in, not simply out of charity, but because Ilara's fragility, her vulnerability, stirred a dormant, agonizing ache. She reminded me, Martha's voice was a low, guttural rasp, of a child I lost, a child they let die. The officials exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from sternness to a flicker of something akin to pity, then quickly back to professional detachment. The irony was devastating. Her deepest, most private grief, the source of her moral ambiguity, was now her desperate plea. She revealed the wooden bird, clutched tightly in her trembling hand, a tangible symbol of her enduring pain, of the life she had tried so desperately and failed to save. She confessed the fear that had driven her, the fear that Ilara too would be abandoned, neglected, left to die by a world too quick to judge and too slow to truly care. This was her confession, her justification, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm between her twisted motives and the perceived benevolence of her actions. The truth, brutal in its simplicity, hung in the air, transforming the room into a crucible of raw emotion. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was a jarring silence, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace, a small defiant flicker against the encroaching cold. The official, his posture still rigid, his expression softened, but only marginally. The rigid structures of law and procedure, however, remained unyielding. Ilara, they declared, could not remain with Martha. Her father's disappearance, coupled with Martha's admitted, albeit complex, personal motives, rendered the situation untenable. The decision, delivered with professional detachment, was a death knell to Martha's fragile, desperate hope. Ilara was placed in the care of state authorities, bound for an institution where she would receive specialized care, a place Martha knew, deep in her gut, would be cold and impersonal, devoid of the singular, complicated connection they had forged. Martha watched her go, a small, bundled form carried away by strangers, her tiny hand, for the first time, not clutching the wooden bird. It had been left behind, lying on the pillow, a silent testament to their brief, complicated bond. A strange sense of emptiness settled over Martha, a void far deeper than the one that had existed before Ilara's arrival. The house, once filled with the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of Ilara's presence, now echoed with a crushing silence, a silence heavier and more profound than any she had known. The town, once buzzing with whispers and suspicion, now offered a different kind of gaze, a reluctant sympathy, mixed with a lingering, uncomfortable curiosity. They had their answers, at least some of them, but the full, messy truth of Martha's actions, her profound and desperate love twisted by grief, remained beyond their grasp. She was neither saint nor villain, but a woman irrevocably shaped by loss, her journey a stark reflection of the world's indifference and the human heart's capacity for both profound love and bewildering, morally ambiguous choices. The consequences of her choices, of her desperate embrace of a surrogate solace, now weighed heavily upon her. The passage of time did not erase the echo of Ilara's presence, nor did it mend the jagged edges of Martha's heart. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, each empty room a silent testament to what had been and what was lost again. Martha found herself drawn to the small, intricately carved wooden bird, left behind on Ilara's pillow. It became her sole companion, a tangible link to the complex tapestry of grief and a warped, desperate love that had defined her recent days. She would hold it for hours, tracing the smooth, worn contours, feeling the weight of its symbolism. It was a reminder not just of Sarah, but of Ilara, and of the profound, often painful connection that binds humanity, even in its most flawed expressions. Her eyes, once hard and unyielding, now held a newfound melancholic depth, a quiet understanding of her own moral landscape. The dark clouds of her past had not dissipated entirely, but a faint, fragile light had begun to pierce through. The act of caring for Ilara, however fraught with personal, ambiguous motives, had broken through the rigid armor Martha had worn for decades. She had faced her deepest grief, not in solitary despair, but through a living, breathing connection, however temporary. The hope that had been hinted at in the resolution was not a grand, triumphant restoration, but a quiet, internal shift. Martha remained a solitary figure, but the silence that enveloped her now was different. It held the faint hum of a soul exposed, wounded, yet paradoxically less afraid. The world outside remained largely unchanged, its biases and its harsh judgment still present, but Martha had, through her flawed and deeply human journey, found a fragile peace within herself. She understood now that sometimes the most profound acts of love are born from the deepest wounds, and that salvation, if it comes at all, often arrives in the most unexpected and morally ambiguous of forms, leaving behind an indelible mark on the soul, like the silent, enduring flight of a tiny wooden bird.